Good evening. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims. I'm the Executive Director at the Institute of Politics. With the Iowa caucuses less than 2 weeks away, and with the New York Times for the first time ever endorsing two Democratic candidates who have very different visions for the country, we are really pleased to be hosting this timely, friendly debate on the future of the Democratic Party. Special thank yous to Abdul El-Sayed, who is a Pritzker Fellow at the IOP this quarter, to Senator Heidi Heitkamp, who is sharing her time with us for the second time this quarter, and Amanda Turkle, who participated in our campaign journalism conference earlier this year. You'll note that we've got a centrist perspective and a further left perspective. We'll let you figure out who's who, and we will be hosting a companion debate to this event on the future of the Republican Party between a centrist and a further right perspective on February 27th, so stay tuned for that. A few nearer term events that I want to mention. On Monday, we will be hosting Republican presidential candidate Bill Weld. Tuesday morning, we're hosting a live taping of Hacks on Tap podcast with David Axelrod and Mike Murphy as they give us an Iowa caucus preview. This event is going to be for UChicago students only because it's in a very small room. And finally, on February 10th, we are hosting a panel discussion on what the broader implications are of the impeachment hearings, both politically in November and constitutionally over the longer term. You can find out more about these and all of our other upcoming events at our website at politics.uchicago.edu. After Amanda Turkle's turn asking the questions of our speakers, we will open it up to your questions. There will be a microphone in the center aisle, and the first three questions, as usual, will be for students. We'd like to ask you now to make sure that your phones are on silent. And here for a formal introduction of our speakers is Madison Irene. Madison is a third year from Buffalo, New York, studying political science and psychology. During her time at the IOP, she has been a Fellows Ambassador, a Fellows Team Lead, and a member of W+ Leadership Development Program. This year, she is a Fellows Program Intern. Please join me in welcoming Madison to the podium.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out and for bearing the cold to come join us in this friendly debate. So the general question that brought us here tonight is, where is the future of the Democratic Party headed? Though for many here, I'd suspect that this abstract question is really a much more personal one. It's a question of, is the Democratic Party headed towards where I want it to go? Tonight we have two fantastic guests who will be asserting their own opinions and preferences on the future of the Democratic Party. Abdul El-Sayed is the former health commissioner of the city of Detroit, and in 2018 he founded Southpaw Michigan, a political action committee which works to elect progressive Democrats. Mr. El-Sayed has continually encouraged bold policies and has rejected the notion that electability should be solely based off of the number of years a nominee has worked in Washington. Mr. El-Sayed supports universal health care, the Green New Deal, and has been quoted as saying that a moderate Democrat will surely lose the 2020 presidential election to Donald Trump. Tonight, we also have with us former Democratic Senator from North Dakota, Heidi Heitkamp. In 2019, Mrs. Heitkamp helped launch the One Country Project, an organization aimed at helping Democrats connect with rural voters. Mrs. Heitkamp has stressed the importance of rural voters in the upcoming 2020 election and has encouraged Democratic candidates to highlight some of President Trump's economic failures as opposed to social issues when speaking to rural communities. Mrs. Heitkamp has also expressed concern for Democratic presidential candidates who support Medicare for all, and has written that supporting the policy would be playing directly into the hands of Trump and Mitch McConnell. Moderating this debate will be Amanda Turkle, who is the current Washington bureau chief with the Huffington Post, and she has also served as the deputy research director at the Center for American Progress and as the managing editor of thinkprogress.org. So again, I thank you all for joining us, and I hope that you are just as excited as I am to see our two guests politely go head-to-head with one another tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming tonight. I just got back from Iowa, where, everyone was in Iowa, but it feels so warm here. It was a high of 1 degree when I was in Iowa, so I'm really enjoying this balmy Chicago weather. So I wanted to jump right in with this issue of electability, because polls show that this is what more than ever people are talking about this election. Who can beat Donald Trump? You know, they're not necessarily saying, you know, who do I want to be president? who do I agree with, who can beat Donald Trump. So I wanted to hear from both of you, and I'll start with you, Senator. For you, what do you think electability looks like this election? Or is this the wrong frame? Should we even be talking about who can beat Donald Trump? Is that a useless question that will lead perhaps down the wrong path?
Well, my personal opinion is absolutely. It's probably the most critical question if you believe, as I do, that Donald Trump is an existential threat to the democracy and that you may have to compromise some of your values, you may have to compromise some of your ideology in order to basically get someone who can beat Donald Trump. I think where we make a mistake on electability is we talk about gender, we talk about race, we talk about all the kind of external stuff. And I think electability is always about someone, it is about the public's reaction or the voters' reaction to a person where they can say, he is someone or she is someone who I believe in, that I think has good intentions and will lead this country in the right direction. And so I think that it's critically important that we kind of understand where we are right now with politics. And to me, and I might get a disagreement here from my colleague, but to me, there is now a 40% solid voting base for Donald Trump. And it may even be higher than that. And certainly when you parse that through the Electoral College, you get frightening results. And we can talk a little bit about that. But there also, I think, is a huge group of people in this country. In fact, they're predicting record turnout where people will, in fact, come out and vote. And they will, in fact, say, if my person didn't make it through the primary, if I didn't get my opponent, I'm still going to be, working the doors. I'm still going to be doing everything I can. Donald Trump is a huge motivator. So the question is, how do you get a message to the 20% of the people, many of them independent Republicans, many of them conservative Democrats, many of them rural voters, who will in fact say, look, I'm ready for a change. I'm ready for somebody to make an argument to me that they can lead the country. And I think electability should be looked at in that lens and not the lens that we traditionally talk about it, gender, race, base turnout, because I think base turnout is going to happen without a lot of initiative. I think the play here in 2020 is going to be the moderate to conservative voters who don't like Donald Trump.
Yeah, I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you for hitting it right with the first question. And I do want to say I extremely admire the work that you're doing to make sure that we have a robust rural turnout, so thank you for that. I have a problem with the term electability because it's one of those terms that's only ever defined after the fact, right? Somebody becomes electable because they were elected. In theory, Barack Obama was not electable until he got elected. In theory, Hillary Clinton was the most electable candidate we'd ever had served as Secretary of State, had been a senator, had lived in the White House, and then wasn't elected. And after the fact, we'd say, well, she wasn't electable. And so I have a hard time thinking about what it means to try and predict who would be electable from where we sit. I also want to make a note about where we are right now. If you look at what happened in 2016, because of course, that's the last piece of data we have about anybody facing up against Donald Trump, we had one of the lowest turnouts in American history. Just in my state alone, which we lost by 10,000 votes, the turnout for Hillary was 2.27 million. That's down from 2.5 million for Barack Obama in 2012 and 2.8 million for Barack Obama in 2008. The question is, why did people not turn out? And this was a matter of people not being enthused to go out to vote for something. We assume that people think about politics like we think about politics. The very fact that you all are here says that you care a lot about politics. Most people are not like you. Most people don't pay attention. They're asking a basic question on an election day. Maybe they'd paid attention a little bit beforehand. And they're asking, who is out there for me? And my sense of it is if we want to get those 4.4 million voters who stayed home in 2016, we've got to give them something to vote for. And for them, this left-right axis that's implicit in the way that we think about politics is not how they categorize themselves. They're asking, who's going to make sure I don't go bankrupt if I get cancer? They're asking who's going to do something about the circumstances of climate change and what I have to breathe in my own community because of that pollution-emitting factory down the street. And they're asking who thinks about whether or not I will have a job and what that job looks like. That means that we have to embrace an agenda that truly does deliver for people. And I'll just finish on one last note. At the end of the day, winning elections, right, is not the point. Serving the American people is the point, and we see winning elections as being an instrumental to doing that. That's why we care about it. And so we've got to ask, what is the morally right thing to do right now? What does it mean to actually stand up around the system that has corrupted so many aspects of people's lives? And my sense of that is that's the reason you embrace the agenda, and because it's going to win you an election.
So do you think, and you alluded to this a little bit, that there is too much emphasis maybe by the media or by politicians placed on this ideological divide? I mean, I know that, when I was recently in Iowa, you talked to someone who's like, I like Bernie first, but then second, or I might like Pete Buttigieg or Joe Biden, who ideologically obviously are very, very different. But, arguably, if, there needs to be some focus on their policies because Joe Biden's term will look very different than Bernie Sanders, but maybe not as different as it would from Donald Trump's. Or maybe, what do you think?
God,
Do you think
so.
that there is a little too much emphasis on ideology and sort of the divisions there and how people will vote?
So I'll say that most people don't think about sorting people along an ideological spectrum. We do this because it's a nifty way of categorizing people's politics. And by doing it, it allows us to impute certain things about where we think they might sit. Most of the world doesn't confine itself to our nifty way of categorizing them. Most people ask very different sets of questions. And one of the problems with being inside politics is you spend so much time with other people who think about politics that you start thinking like they do, rather than being able to put yourself in the shoes of an everyday voter. And it's mind-bending, because if you look at just, again, 2016 Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders, who was furthest left, won his primaries in Michigan, in Minnesota, in Wisconsin. In fact, there were about as many people who voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary in West Virginia as voted for Hillary Clinton in the general. And so these folks aren't asking, well, how far left is he, and where do I sit on this continuum, and therefore, where should I be picking? They're asking, who seems to be thinking about my problems? So rather than left-right, what I'll submit to you today is that actually people are thinking top-down. Is this person interested in me and my well-being, or are they more interested in the institutions that seem to be putting me down everywhere I go? Whether it's the employer who's locked me out, whether it's the health insurance company that's forcing me to pay a deductible to get the care I already paid for, whether it's that corporation down the street that's spewing a bunch of crap into my lungs and my kids' lungs, are they for me or are they for them? And I think one of the reasons why we're starting to see a candidate like Bernie do so well in these communities is because it's quite clear that he's got integrity about being for me. And if we want to win this election, we've got to make sure that no matter where you sit on our sort of manufactured left-right spectrum, that those folks know that we're for them.
I think Donald Trump would like nothing more than to run against someone who he can label as socialist. If you want to look at, you can judge this however you want to look at it, but look at what Donald Trump has done to try and disgrace and diminish Joe Biden. And today Donald Trump's tweet is, they're trying to take it away from Bernie again. So, he's like, because he knows a lot of the Bernie voters, in fact, in the past have been Trump voters. And so he's trying to maintain his constituency. But, I think that this primary season has been rich in ideas. And you can decide where that is on the continuum of ideology. But I will tell you, a lot of what we're talking about is who can motivate people, who will be, that inspiration that will get people to knock doors, and I don't disagree with that at all. But I think you also have to think about who can be demonized, who can't. If this is a choice, if Donald Trump makes this about his opponent, and we don't make it about Donald Trump, we will lose. As sure as I'm sitting here, this race has to be a referendum. It has to be a referendum on Donald Trump. And you know, it's interesting because I think in places where people say, well, there's so many people out there who are gonna, you know, I care about this, I care about that. But if you look at the University of Michigan, basically thermometer on consumer confidence, which has been a bellwether for re-electability, that should worry all of us. It should worry all of us who believe that Donald Trump is a threat to our democracy. That in terms of people's sense of you know, not the folks on the Indian reservation and not the folks we talk about, not the folks with a disabled child, I get that. But when you look at the majority of Americans, they feel pretty good about economically where they are right now, driven by a lot of the proposals that Bernie promoted, like increase in minimum wage, which has increased the salaries of people on the lower quartile. Of course, Trump takes credit for it, but if you look at where those increases are coming from, they're coming from places like that have raised the minimum wage. So I think that it's really critically important that we nominate someone not only with a message that is inclusive and positive and moves this country forward, gives, you know, kind of the Barack Obama, we can be better, we can be this country that we hope to be, but we have to nominate someone who Donald Trump doesn't make center stage of his campaign.
So I appreciate the points. The place where I'll push back is I actually don't think, you know, that people's sense of the connection between these macroscopic indicators of where the economy is and their daily lives match up. I actually think that for a lot of folks, it may be that unemployment's at an all-time low, but underemployment's at an all-time high. Folks are worried about the fact that they have to work multiple jobs, none of which provide benefits. And I think the mistake we actually made in 2016 was that part of our message was that it's all good. And we should be electing a Democrat because, of course, Barack Obama steered us past this recession, put us in a position where people should be happy about where the economy is. We all know that Donald Trump has ridden that economy, but I actually think what has happened is the system that we have in place has decoupled macroeconomic indicators from the circumstances of real people's lives, and I think they feel that. And I think if we're not speaking to the level of insecurity and the level of challenge that people face, we miss the point. To the point about demonization, they're going to demonize anybody we put forward, right? It doesn't really quite matter who that person is. And I worry because what we did last time was nominate an institutionalist who had had all of the right feathers in the cap, who then got demolished because there was no real message. And if we don't have an alternative to Donald Trump that is articulating a very clear message, that is able to organize people on that message, we will lose. We don't fall in line, unfortunately, as Democrats. We fall in love. And we've got to be asking, where is the energy right now? I worry a lot about trying to do exactly what we did in 2016 and nominate somebody who seems to be the right person, the next person up, and lose again.
And I would just caution you. So if you go out in Real Clear Politics and you do the polls, right? And you click on his favorabilities, he's consistently, I mean his by the president's, he's consistently between 43 and 45%. And it really doesn't move much. But you click on his economic performance, he's got +8, +10 in terms of his economic performance rating, and it's over 50%. And so if people are voting those macro issues, and they feel like, you know, I'm doing okay, I'm optimistic, you know, they hear every day that unemployment's at 3.5%, and I come from a part of the country where he has decimated our economy. He's decimated the farm economy with his trade policies. And those people will still walk over hot coals for him because they believe that he has their best interest at heart. And so I would just say, you know, and maybe it's just we've gotten so used to the James Carville, it's the economy, right? Stupid. And so I think that these factors matter. I think you have to make an economic argument against this president. And I will tell you, if I have one criticism of this field of candidates, is that they are not making an economic argument. They're making an argument for healthcare. They're making an argument for, expansion of Social Security, free college education. They're making all those arguments, and you could say, well, those are the economic arguments. They aren't the economic arguments to the average American. They're not. It's like, can I afford to retire? Can I afford this? Can I afford that? And healthcare is probably a classic example, and we're not going to agree on what the solution could be for healthcare, but I am telling you that these economic indicators, these polls of polls on his job, his economic performance, and these polls of polls, when a push comes to shove, and people have to say, do I plug my nose and vote for this guy again? The reason why people are going to plug their nose and vote for this guy again is because of the economy.
So I don't disagree with you. I think you've well established that Donald Trump is going to be a strong candidate. And I actually think that the reason he's going to be a strong candidate is because he was able to speak to a level of economic anxiety, both in your part of the country and mine. I'm from Michigan. There's probably not a place in the country that has been more decimated by his policies, be it the trade war and what it has done to manufacturing or to agriculture. Those are the two biggest industries in my state. That being said, if we think that our economic message is going to be responding with the kind of message that we've seen come out of the Hillary Clinton camp, that we see coming out of the moderate camp on the Democratic side, and that we're going to win, I think that's the wrong approach. And if you just look at all of these issues, expanding Social Security is about the ability to retire with dignity. Addressing the cost, the gargantuan cost of healthcare in people's lives, is it about addressing what causes 66% of bankruptcies in this country. That's healthcare. And if we're talking about college, it's about asking, how is it that I can afford to get my kid into an earning strata that allows them to buy themselves out of the insecurity that I suffer today? That's an economic issue. And beyond that, there has been nobody in this crop who has talked more. I will say Andrew Yang has been hitting the economic argument in a very particular way, in a very unique way. So good on Andrew Yang. But when you talk about raising the minimum wage, when you talk about making sure that parents in a working family are able to afford the basic roof over their kids' head and afford their housing, that's been on the left. The Green New Deal, we think about it as a green argument. It is an economic argument about job security through a jobs guarantee, buying us out of the existential threat of climate change. So I agree with you. Donald Trump is a strong economic competitor. So we've got to hit him on the economics, and that is about progressive messaging.
Senator, what specifically do you think that Democrats need to be saying to make more inroads with rural voters?
I honestly believe that they need to not scare people, right? So you think about what happened with Obamacare. We lost, I want you just to visualize this. North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Over the last 50 years, representation there would be about 40% Democrat and about 60% Republican. I was the last Democrat elected in that corridor. And if you want to control the agenda, you better control the Senate. And if you want to control the Senate, you better figure out how you can take these important messages and talk about them in a way that moves this country forward, that gives people hope, that responds to their concerns, but doesn't scare the hell out of them. And when you look at Obamacare, as modest as what it was, look what it did to decimate the Democratic Party kind of writ large across the country. We lost thousands of Democrats, not just in national races, but in local races. So here, I'll give you an example on college tuition. So free college. Let me tell you, that is not something, that's not a winning strategy to win over moderate and conservative Democrat voters. You know what might be? To say, look, we're going to restructure all your student debt because you have been overcharged for interest. We're going to write it down. If you paid 6% interest, we're going to apply that to your principal, and we're going to get you out of debt faster. But you're going to earn your way to pay your student debt. And when somebody goes to college and people say, well, are you for free college tuition? I said, no. If I have that money, I'm putting it in early childhood. I'm putting it in childhood trauma treatment. I'm putting it where I think it's going to matter and achieve greater results and make that investment when kids are younger. So I could make a compelling argument. I have just as much passion for people who are struggling, but I can make a compelling alternative argument with a more moderate message that will resonate. And that's really what you're seeing in the healthcare debate. If there's been one issue in the Democratic Party where this, where the goals are the same, but the strategies or the tactics are different, you see it in healthcare, whether it's going to be a public option or Medicare for all, or whether it's going to be expanding children's health insurance. When you think about healthcare and you think about government-operated healthcare, you think about Medicare and Medicaid. We expanded Medicaid, put millions of people, which Trump's trying to take away, millions of people on a Medicaid, which is critically important, honestly, for opioid and for mental health treatment, a critical piece. And then we put children on children's health insurance. And so we're moving in that direction. And at one point in North Dakota, 70% of all the people in North Dakota were on a healthcare system that was funded by the federal government, whether it was Medicaid, Medicare, and we're gonna get there. I mean, we're gonna get to solving this problem. But if I were talking about healthcare, I'd say the costs are too high. We aren't gonna keep paying for bad results. We're gonna do things that actually lower the cost of healthcare. And when people hear Medicare for all, it's just like more of the same, only we're all gonna pay for it. And so I think there is a way to, I'm concerned about litmus tests in the Democratic Party because we all have the same goal, but we have different ideas how to get there. And we have to respect those ideas. And it's not gonna be just the one idea, free college or Medicare for all, that's going to motivate people to come out. It's going to be, I understand and know your problem. I know that you're struggling to have children, so we're gonna have paid family leave and we're gonna do it this way. I think there's a way to talk about a moderate Democratic message that I think has a better chance of carrying the day in this election.
So I know you want to jump in, but I have a question first. So you talked about finding a candidate who will be hard for Trump to demonize. Do you think there is a candidate right now, and who is it, and who is making arguments, do you think, that's not scaring rural voters?
Well, I think that's I don't want to, I want you to understand that all of these candidates, my husband has me trained, when people say, who are you supporting? I say, all of them. Love all of them, because they're not Donald Trump. So I'm very excited about the field, but I think that don't trust my instincts, trust the president's. Who doesn't the president want to run against? It's Joe Biden, because he's concerned about Pennsylvania, and he's concerned about Michigan, and he's concerned that those union voters are going to come home to somebody who's been standing with them for a lot of years, and who doesn't look like they're going to be radical on these ideas. And so, to me, there's many people in this race, and the reality is, though, is that they all can stand up to Donald Trump. If I have a criticism of Bernie, I'll tell you what it is. Bernie Sanders did the Choice Act. He's the prime sponsor. You know what that is? The president says he did it. And it is the reforms that Bernie promoted in the VA system when he was chair of the Veterans Affairs Committee. It's an incredible piece of legislation. Bernie cares deeply about veterans, and he lets Trump get by with saying he did the Choice Act. I'm like, if I were Bernie, I would call a press conference every time Trump did that and say, that's bullshit. He did not do the Choice Act. I did the Choice Act. And that's my accomplishment. And so, we let Trump get by with a ton of stuff, whether it's economic or whether it's taking credit for, wage increases in the lower quartile that he had nothing to do with. I mean, we've got to be much more aggressive across the board with this president on economic messages.
So actually, I want to talk to you more about Medicare for all, but as a Bernie Sanders supporter, do you think that he needs to talk about bipartisanship more? Obviously, Hillary Clinton just came out and said no one likes Bernie, no one wants to work with Bernie, he's never gotten anything done.
That's not fair.
Right. So you don't think that's true as someone
Choice
served
Act.
with Bernie?
The single greatest thing that's happened for veterans and probably veterans healthcare in the last X number of years, Bernie led.
So do you think that Bernie needs to talk more about what he's done to work across the aisle? And just what are your thoughts on Hillary's comment?
Yeah. you can see my Twitter from yesterday. I want to respond to a couple of things, though. One of the interesting implicits that the senator raised is that Obamacare, however tepid it was, lost us a vast swath of voters. Like, if we followed that logic, honestly, we would be doing nothing because we would be so worried about scaring people off. The purpose of governing is solving problems for folks. And yeah, is the other side going to demonize us for attempting to do that? Sure. But they haven't succeeded in repealing the ACA yet. And the reason why is because once you've empowered folks in their lives, they like it. And so we've got to be bold about saying, what is the next step in solving this set of problems? When it comes to the healthcare conversation, I do think that we all want coverage. But as a doctor, I have to be honest that not all coverage is created equal. And the challenge that we have right now is out-of-pocket costs that hit people on the back end of getting their care after they get sick, which is what drives people into bankruptcy. That happens because the private insurance industry has made a habit of both raising the costs and then passing them back off onto the people. If we're not solving that problem, honestly engaging with solving that problem, we are leaving people in a position of insecurity in the hardest moments of their lives. Like, we all got into this business because we actually want to be solving problems. Medicare for All is a problem, is a solution to a problem that people face in their lives. And I just think that we have to stand up for it. You talked about restructuring a college debt. My point is just why don't we just erase college debt? It's a thing we could do, right? So we talk about these sort of halfway solutions that are both not necessarily all that workable. People don't understand how they work and why they work and if they work, right? Think about something like the EITC, right? It's a great piece of policy, but people don't actually see it coming into their back pockets because of the way it's deployed. And at the same time, we are in a position where we have an opportunity to be articulating problems and saying that we have solutions to solving them. To get to the point about Hillary, look, I agree with the senator that anything that is taking our eye off the ball in beating Donald Trump is not useful. These conversations about trying to relitigate 2016 are not useful. The idea that Bernie Sanders doesn't know how to reach across the aisle is not useful based on the exhibit that the senator proposed, but also just think about his work on the civil war in Yemen, right? And his work opposing the brutality of the Saudi regime. He led that working across the aisle with fellow senators on an issue that he took up and decided to take up because it was the right thing to do. There's this notion that you can't believe in a revolutionary approach to doing things and also work with other people who don't. And we've got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. I think that this is something that Bernie Sanders specifically, but a lot of folks on the left have shown their ability to do. Yeah. And then the last point I'll just make is that, again, we cannot hold ourselves hostage to what they will say about us. Right? Barack Obama was named Barack Obama. As a guy named Abdul El-Sayed who ran for office, I knew what they were going to do to my name. I understood what the circumstances were. The question is, well, if we followed that same logic, people like me, people like him, would never actually run because, of course, they're going to say, you're a Muslim and you're a terrorist and you're et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got to stop with the fear of their fear-mongering, and we've got to be bold. And when people understand what we fight for, they will stand up and fight with us.
Well, and probably make a final point here. People are tired of being told something's going to happen when nothing happens. If people hate government and politics, it's because every 2 years or 4 years you're promised the sun, the star, and the moon, and nothing happens.
Then we got to make it happen.
You know what? I'm going to ask you. Let's go back to 2010. And I went out, and let me tell you, in 2012 when I ran, almost 100% of the ads that ran against me were because I supported Obamacare. I supported the Affordable Care Act. And I'll defend it to this day, supporting the Affordable Care Act. You have 59, and at one point 60 United States senators. You have a president who is a Democrat, and you have a House of Representatives that is Democratic, and you couldn't get Medicare for All done. Why is that? Because it's too expansive. Because people like Larry Summers come out and say it's going to cost $60 trillion. Because it is too easy to demonize. And so people want problems solved, and they want to know that you can deliver. And if Bernie were sitting here, I'd say, if you could get Medicare for All, why didn't you get it in 2010? When all the stars were aligned. And you could say because those weak-kneed Democrats like Bacchus from Montana or North Dakota. Let me tell you that the one thing that you have to do is you have to be realistic with voters on what you can do. You have to show them that you can get things accomplished. And when you promise the sun, the star, and the moon, you lose credibility. And I would say, why didn't we restructure student debt? And so I know why we didn't, and I know what the obstacles were. And so I think that a moderate message that moves us in the direction and that actually tackles these problems, that people can say, yep, I get it, that would move us forward. That's a message that people can believe in, that people can say, yes, it can happen, and I think that at the end of the day, it's a winning message.
Although, do you think that Trump had a moderate message? Because it seemed like he had a very extreme message, and people.
I don't think he had an extreme message at all. He didn't have a policy message. He had a message of grievance.
Do you think Hillary's message was too liberal?
I think her message was too detailed and not inspirational enough.
That's exactly the point. So inspirational has to mean that you're going to do something serious and big. Like very rarely do you think football, right? Use a crude sports analogy for a second. Nobody ever says, we got to rally so we can go kick a field goal from the 35th, right? We need to score a touchdown. And right now the problem is that we end up doing this thing of trying to negotiate with ourselves before we ever even get to the negotiating table from the other side. So the reason we couldn't get Medicare for All done is because the leadership was focused on, how about we take a conservative healthcare strategy, which is exactly what Obamacare was. It was hatched out of the Heritage Foundation and then passed by Mitt Romney in Massachusetts. Why don't we take a conservative healthcare strategy and then try and make it Democratic policy and think that somehow the conservatives weren't going to push back? And then when we did, we worked, before we ever even got to the conversation with Republicans, we were so busy trying to negotiate with the healthcare industry that we took things like public option off the table. And so part of the bigger picture here also that we haven't touched on is the fact that we on the left, unfortunately, as Democrats, have been too busy accommodating all of these industries that have been paying for our campaigns for far too long when it comes down to making policy that is better for people versus better for industry. And so you look at the ACA, it literally implanted the health insurance industry into American healthcare moving forward. We all know that the reason why healthcare is too expensive, inequitable, and ineffective is because we have a private health insurance system. And when we take their money and then sit down and ask them what they want, we're never going to be able to deliver on the ends that we want to deliver on. And so it's not just about the policies, it's about a system of politics that says that actually if we believe in working people, we have to invest in working people, we have to ask them to be a part of campaigns that we run, and then when we get to the table, it's not about what industry wants anymore, it's about what we can build movements around.
Yeah, and I would say that in healthcare, when people say the biggest problem in healthcare is private insurance, be careful. It's not private because when you look at the medical device manufacturers, you look at the prescription drug industry. I'll give you an example, and my doctor, my husband's a physician, okay? So he comes home this week and he says, guess what? We have a rapid strep test that we charge about $80 for, and we can get the results within 4 minutes. Now, the powers that be say we need to change that strep test, right? Now we're going to charge $160, and you have to wait for 30 minutes. And the patient is not going to wait for 30 minutes to find out if they have strep throat, right? So it's not that much better. It's not that much value added.
Sure.
So he went out on Amazon.com and found out that he could buy 25 of the rapid strep tests for $1.50 each. That's what's wrong with healthcare.
But you know why?
We are overpaying for healthcare, and it's not about insurance. It is about how we deliver healthcare. And the more disruptors like Amazon, the more disruptors we have, the more the industry, whether it's the healthcare providers, the doctors, the hospitals, are going to have to change the way they do business because of the disruption. And we've got to encourage disruption.
That's just not how it works. The reason, the powers that be, are the health insurers. They're the ones who
man.
decide what's going to be reimbursed and at what rate.
I mean, I
That
could
is-
not,
that is-
I
that is
could
how it
not
works.
disagree more.
But I mean, just like-
and so we can,
I mean,
we
fine.
aren't going to have a debate on healthcare, but I will tell you that the providers have a lot more
Well, I mean,
power
I
in
think-
wait a
how
minute,
they
we have
deliver
about-
healthcare than
But
the
that's what
insurers.
we're here to do, right?
Yeah.
We're here to have a debate
on
about
health
where the
insurance.
party is going.
Yeah.
And I think if you agree that Medicare for all is a fundamental question about where the party is headed, then we do have to have a debate about healthcare. And if we want to have a debate about healthcare, the question is, what are the problems with respect to the incentive sets that exist in healthcare as it stands?
Yeah.
And who sets those incentives? And the point of Medicare for all is about creating a government monopsony that allows the government to negotiate those rates and make decisions about how things get reimbursed. Whether it's debating with the industry.
When it is Donald Trump's CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, when they're the ones doing the negotiating, how do you feel about that?
I mean, look,
Right? I mean,
at some point,
this is about politics. This is about who's in charge. And so when you put the government in charge, then whoever is sitting in that seat is the person in charge of your health care. He's taking away your health care. This is the problem with what the Democrats are doing right now. Donald Trump is in court today taking away Medicare, Medicaid expansion. He's in court today taking away your protections for pre-existing conditions. He's in court today taking away your life-saving screenings that you should get for free.
so we should never have expanded Medicaid then, because it would take-
Absolutely, we should have
So, but that's the
expanded
point,
Medicaid.
right? We should be fighting to expand those services.
but you're the one
and if Republicans
criticizing
want to pull
the
them
Affordable
back,
Care
that's
Act.
fine. I'm not criticizing Affordable Care. I'm just saying it didn't go far enough.
So Abdul, what will happen with Medicare for all and that movement if Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders lose?
Well, look, we'll keep going. I mean, it's not like this goes away because two candidates who ran on it don't win. I mean, we have a lot of work to do to make sure that they do.
So a critical
But-
question.
But the question was asked to me.
Yeah.
The point that I'm making is people want this. This is not just about candidates fighting for it. This is about grassroots coming together, recognizing that right now the situation is not tenuous, and that we have to be fighting for policy that actually benefits everyday folk. And that's going to mean butting right up against the health insurance industry and the tech industry and the pharmaceutical industry and the hospitals.
Yeah, and what happens to Medicare for all and the Affordable Care Act if Donald Trump wins?
You know,
That's
keep
the
fighting.
question we should be asking. And so, you're going to see the reason why the Republicans have consistently opposed any kind of expansion of Medicaid, any kind of expansion of the Children's Health Insurance Program, any kind of expansion of allowing people to buy in early in Medicare, and a public option is because they know this is moving in a trend direction that will achieve the result in the long term. And so, which is competition in the marketplace for people to basically get affordable health care.
It's hard for me as a doctor to look people in the eye and say, just wait for the long term. It's just hard. So I'm not willing to cede it to some long term while people right now can't afford basic health care simply because we have decided that we're going to assent to an industry that's unnecessary. And I agree with you. They're going to keep trying to repeal those things. That's what they do. But the fact is, when you actually pass real, meaningful legislation, it's really hard to claw back. That's why, after 3 years, the Trump administration still hasn't figured out how to do it. And it lost in the midterm. Yeah. So my sense is that let's score a touchdown, right? And if at some point we get stopped and we have to kick a field goal, I'm fine getting 3 points.
Okay,
So I just want one point.
We have about 2 minutes of questions, so I'm going to let both of you say something.
But one point. You know why we still have the Affordable Care Act? Because I was able to get reelected or get elected in North Dakota. If I hadn't been elected in North Dakota and it had been a Republican sitting in my seat, the Affordable Care Act's gone. And so my point is, you better learn how to win elections, and not just elections on the coast, not elections among your base, because if we just play a base game, we're going to become ungovernable in this country. And so to me, let's get the politics right, and then we can move the policy in the right direction.
So the only response I'll make is that implicit to that argument is that you're arguing that a more progressive candidate could not have won in North Dakota. And I'll just say that the last Democratic primary for president, Bernie Sanders won 64%.
It was a caucus, it wasn't a primary.
64%.
And 200 people showed up.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to move to questions. So line up at the mic and can you introduce yourself? If you're a student here, mention that too. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's James Scretta. I'm a PhD student in music history and theory here at the University of Chicago. Thank you so much for having this debate. I grew up in rural Northeast Iowa, so I understand what it's like trying to run for office as a Democrat in that kind of rural Midwestern space. Basically, a lot of communities feel disaffected by a mainstream media apparatus that sells them an image of what it's like to be an American in this country that's fed through culture that is just wildly different from the kind of culture that rural agriculture-based economy America is like. And unfortunately then it leaves a space for something like Fox News to step in and tell people what their politics should be. But when you actually have conversations with these people, I think about my parents and the uncomfortable conversation we had over our Christmas dinner. They're both Republicans, yet they care a lot about well-being and how people are doing in the world. I can make a relatively convincing argument to them for why it is that we should be willing to fight for something like Medicare for All or fight for something like a universal program. The only thing that seems to be really getting in the way is just like a bought and paid for opinion that is fed to them. But when you have a real conversation without, the media stepping in between and getting in the way, I think there's a lot of room to not let people be to rest in the kind of fear that these conservative media institutions. Sure, yeah. I mean, it's a nuanced question. But this is the issue. This is what seems to be at the heart of the issue about people being fearful. So should that be something that we need to cave to? How is it that we actually go about addressing this issue of talking about these things that really we don't need to be afraid of?
I'm assuming that's for me. Okay. I think that there's an old adage, and it's unfortunate in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. And so we need to grow the idea in a way that makes it more acceptable. Think about that. I would take you back to the fight in the early 60s over Medicare and Medicaid. I mean, Ronald Reagan did videos saying this was socialism, and it was like nobody, and the Republican Party for years talked about how horrible Medicare was, and over time, everybody now accepts Medicare as a critical part of how we help take care of elderly, and Medicaid is how we take care of people in poverty and people disabled. And so no one's talking about cutting those programs, although I guess Donald Trump did today at Davos, so he'll change his mind tomorrow. But the point would be that these are conversations that you cannot change people's minds overnight. They have to be long-term and they have to be sustained. And when one party gives up, which is what we're doing with One Country, when one party gives up, even showing up in northern Iowa, by the way, J.D. Shulkin is on our board, and we hope he's a great messenger. But when you give up showing up, you lose the opportunity to have that conversation because you're up against Fox News. And so what I'm saying is we have to operate everywhere, and the message that might resonate here in South Chicago is not the message that's going to work in northern Iowa. The problems are the same, but we have to address how we approach those problems differently in our conversations. And we have to not be, I know Bernie talks about a revolution, maybe I'm just short-sighted. I think a lot of these great ideas are evolutionary, and you have to really work at them, and it's a long-term process.
So I'm going to agree with what the senator said, right? Medicare was really hard to get done, and once we got it done, people really liked it. Imagine what we could do with Medicare for All. And I'm personally, one of the things I do find deeply frustrating with our party and the conversation that we have is that in talking about Donald Trump, there is an implicit aspersion that's cast upon the people who voted for him. I've got a really diverse family. My uncle voted for Donald Trump, and you got to imagine my Uncle Rick, just, the Muslim guy voted for Donald Trump is a little much. But my Uncle Rick voted for Donald Trump. My stepmom, who raised me, is a daughter of the American Revolution. And I love them deeply, very much. And when you talk to them about why they voted for him, has less to do with a lot of the most vile things that he does and says. There's a lot more to do with feeling left out by a party that hasn't been paying attention. The interesting thing, though, is when you sit down with them, just like your experience, and you start talking to them about the policies themselves, right? Forget the monikers, forget the hashtags, right? Forget what they've been conditioned to think about by Fox News. When you talk about those policies, a lot of folks are like, yeah, that really resonates. And there's a reason why there's always some 30 to 35% of folks who believe in a Medicare for all, even on the right, because the policies make sense and they would really solve problems for people. And so my sense is that we've got to get away from the sort of like boogeyman politics of Donald Trump and the people who support him and start having the courage of our convictions in being able to speak truth to pain, not just truth to power, but truth to pain about what's wrong and how we solve it. And you'll find that a lot of folks will surprise you. Again, that's why I don't believe in left-right. I believe in top and bottom. And our politics has to be about leveraging the folks on the bottom to be able to lift them and believe in their own intelligence and their own capacity to make great decisions for themselves, but have the ability to step up and say, I believe that you can see the value in this. Doesn't mean that you have to be from California to believe in Medicare for all, that you can see the value in this and that you'd fight for it if we were able to have the courage to get past the attitude that we have about you to think that you're not worth talking to.
And you mentioned the media. I just wanted to add that media consolidation is very bad, and that a handful of media outlets, even if they're good media outlets, should not be controlling what everyone around the country hears. Okay, next question.
Thank you.
Yes.
So one of the things that both of y'all mentioned was the midterm victories in 2018. The midterm victories in 2018 that allowed the Democrats to take back the House. Many of the majority makers were what we would classify as more moderate Democrats and sort of speaking to the issues specific to those districts as opposed to tying into a national plan. So in 2020, when there's going to be a presidential candidate at the top of the ticket, do you think that there will be space for down ballot candidates to, if they need to, distance themselves from the top of the ticket? And if that space doesn't exist, my question is, would you prefer to have your least favorite Democratic candidate as president, but 51 Democratic senators? Or would you prefer to have your favorite Democratic nominee as president, but 49 Democratic senators with Mitch McConnell in control?
I presume that's to me.
I think that there's a presumption that this is something that's against the left. I'm actually a Warren supporter, but my question is actually to both people because I think there are some places where the moderate message doesn't get people out to vote. And I think there are some places where the revolutionary message scares the hell out of people. So how do we bridge that gap?
The first thing I would tell you is that when I ran in 12, when I disagreed with President Obama, I said I disagreed with President Obama. And when people said, well, if you disagree with him so much, why are you supporting him? Why are you voting for him? Because I didn't play that game. I was voting for the president. I'd tell people I was voting for the president. I would carry around the Paul Ryan budget, right? And I would put it on a placard, and I would go through all the things that were really bad, like cutting Medicare, privatizing, all of the things. I said, because this is horrible, and we can't let this happen. And so each candidate is going to have to figure out what their comfort level is. But I will tell you, and there's probably some political scientists in this room, we've done a lot of study on Senate races. And in 2016, it is the first time that every senator who was elected from a political party was elected from the same political party that represents the election in the presidential race. By that I mean no senator was able to get elected in a state where Donald Trump was elected in 16. That tells you that these down ballot races have become nationalized in the world of Trump. And it's going to take a very clever candidate to basically break that stranglehold. And so I think there's a couple places, Colorado, Maine, those theories are going to be tested again. But I would tell you, your question is very, very wise. And we have to think about what that means down ballot in terms of everybody now in the Democratic Party represents Medicare for all, when the majority of people actually on the platform are not Medicare for all Democrats.
So 2 points to that. Number one, yeah, we flipped the House, and a lot of the folks that people pay attention to that won in swing districts were more moderate in their positions or more centrist in their positions. At the same time, we also turned a lot of deep blue districts substantially more progressive, right? And that was another part of the
By
story.
running against other Democrats.
Other Democrats.
Yeah.
And I'm totally cool with that. In fact, I think it ought to happen, because if people are not well served ideologically by the people who represent them, then they're not being well represented. That's how democracy is, right? And so I think there's been a shifting in this country. I also think, to be honest, it's going to be really interesting longer term to think about what the Republicans do after Donald Trump. Because at some point they're going to wake up with a real bad hangover. And I'm serious. They're going to have to figure out, they're going to be like, look, demographically, we're just losing. Like, fact of the matter. I mean, if you just look at what happened in Texas, Beto O'Rourke took the 4 biggest major metros in Texas by 800,000 votes, right? And Obama had won those by 100,000 in 2012, right? So a lot of these major metros in traditionally red states are growing big time because folks like you are graduating here and going there, right? So that's happening in Georgia, that's happening in Texas, that's happening in Arizona. So the map is changing, demographics are changing, and so they're gonna have to figure out, like, well, actually this like alienating people of color thing, right? And this like running on white nationalism thing, not gonna work very well in the future. So I'm interested to see what happens. I actually think that the full electorate is going to be like ratcheting left on things like climate change, which is at this point just really, really hard to deny, on white nationalism itself. And I may be wrong. A lot of people disagree with me on this. But what that says about what the left will do in response, right? Because in the end, elections are an exercise in contrast, is really interesting. I'll just say this. When I ran in 2018, I was really thankful to earn endorsements from AOC and Bernie Sanders. After I didn't win the primary, my opponent, who was in the general election, was substantially to the right of me, and Bernie Sanders came back to Michigan and rallied for her. We have this assumption, right? Like, the way the world works on Twitter is the way the world works. And because, unfortunately, like, there's a narrative that the media plays into what they cover and what they choose to cover and how they choose to cover what they cover, all of that plays into this narrative that we sometimes don't see. So the idea that a President Bernie Sanders isn't going to support somebody to the right of him in a state that may be far to the right of what Vermont is, that doesn't make sense to me. It's just not real. And so I would argue that we have to be careful not to assume that what's happening on Twitter or what's happening in the ideological framing of the conversation is what actually happens on the ground.
Yeah, and I would encourage you to go out on One Country Project and look at trajectories, because we could win 7% of the popular vote and still lose the presidential race and definitely lose the Senate.
I know
that's
you didn't
frightening
get your
thought.
hypothetical.
And partly because you're all moving, people are self-selecting their political ideology. I mean, my daughter lives in California. She didn't want to move to North Dakota. I keep trying to get her there.
Okay, go ahead.
Come to Michigan.
Well, Michigan, yeah, come to North Dakota and I'll introduce you to some of the folks that used to vote Democrat.
Trust me, I could do the same in
Yeah,
Michigan.
yeah.
Hey guys, thank you for the talk. Sorry. My name is Hyder, and I'm also a medical student here. What I'm interested in, and this is really for the senator, although I would appreciate both of your takes on this, is if we do take the view that Trump won because he tapped into this frustration that's been building up for decades and decades. You know, labor union membership in this country is at an all-time low. Jobs have been shipped overseas. These things are all really real issues, and Trump tapped into that. So if we go back to electing someone like Joe Biden, you've kind of corrected course for 4 years, but what happens after that? Those same things that have been happening that made Trump happen in the first place are still going to go on. And then my second question is around how you make change. You know, if we look at the greatest accomplishments that the Democratic Party has made in the 20th century, the New Deal, civil rights, those massive things, they were not if we were to cave to this idea that you got to be moderate, you got to be centrist, you got to not scare people. Civil rights in the 1960s scared white moderates, and if you wanted to be on the right side of history, you had to be bold, and frankly, you had to scare a few people to make that change happen. the New Deal was radical, civil rights was radical, et cetera. So when you have that legacy, how can you say that the only way to make change is through the center?
Number one, you would have never gotten the New Deal in an economy that was growing at 3%, where there was 3.5% unemployment. The New Deal was a product of desperation, and it gave an opportunity to advance things like Social Security. But we didn't get health care in the New Deal, even though that was a concept. And so, you can't take things out of historical context and say, look, he did the New Deal and therefore he was bold, and I said you had 20% unemployment and people were starving to death, and you had the Dust Bowl and people were moving. It's against an economic problem. And so what I would say is that there's nothing modest about a public option. There's nothing modest about using carbon capture as a strategy to tackle climate, which means that you have to start looking at how you're going to solve the problem. You can't achieve climate goals without carbon capture strategies. And the way we got carbon capture moved forward in Congress was we worked a deal that included Sheldon Whitehouse and Mitch McConnell. So if you want to tackle problems today that are going to actually have lasting results, you're going to work across the aisle and you're going to figure out how you're going to compromise. Doesn't mean that you have to give up your principles or that we're not forward thinking. And every election's different. And I would tell you that this election is not about the economic future of this country. This election's about our democracy. This is election about changing norms that we have accepted. I have a friend who basically said, what America is learning is that their democracy is on the honor system. And when you elect a dishonorable president, the democracy's in trouble. All of the checks and balances, all of the things that we learned in Government 101, they don't matter when you have somebody who doesn't care about them or even know about them. And so, and maybe I'm talking too much like Joe Biden for people in the room, but what got him in the race was seeing the institutional challenges that we have that are unraveling and saying, we need to put that back together before we begin this process of moving our country forward in a direction that deals with income inequality, that deals with climate, that deals with access to healthcare, that deals with systemic and generational racism that is tearing our country apart if we don't fix it, and bringing our country together.
So the only thing I'll push on is just to say that I do agree that our democracy is on the line. But I think what is tearing at the fabric of our democracy are these structural features of deep structural inequality. And whether or not we are willing to address the system that has created that inequality. And it manifests in a number of different ways. It looks different in rural communities versus urban communities. But if we're unwilling to name it and fix it, the system that is accelerating climate change, the system that is leaving us with record low unemployment, despite a gig economy where nobody's fully employed, and leaving people at risk of medical bankruptcy just for getting sick, like that's what this election has to be about. And I think that there is a level of privilege sometimes in rooms like this, because oftentimes we're lucky enough not to be touched by a lot of those things, right? That we lose that and we say, well, I want to go back to the system of norms that we had when everybody got along and there was civility. And my point to that is that if you want to get that back, then we have to be willing to quell the ways that this system is affecting people, which means that we've got to fight to address it. And my point is just that I do think that right now we've got a situation akin to what we saw in the Great Depression. It's just affecting a particular group of people, right, because of the level of inequality that we have. And if we don't deal with it with that level of urgency, we are both going to miss the point and lose our democracy in the process.
Great. Next question.
So I believe we are the only country, only democracy in the world with a two-party system. And this discussion is so resonant today to me because while people talk about the Thanksgiving table and the uncle who supported Trump, there's also now a broader conversation amongst Democrats to say, I am choosing between maybe Biden and Bernie, or Klobuchar and Warren. And that is also the dining room table conversation amongst Democrats. And I feel that sometimes moderation is confused with incrementalism. Where do you see space in both of your views for an approach to the electorate that says, these are my beliefs, but I can be an incrementalist. I do believe there can be multiple steps to get.
Well, you're kind of describing me, aren't you? I mean, you know, I think that I am moderate by temperament because I see moderation as having ideals and great ideas of what you want done, but moving people forward in a direction that is realistic. And so I think you're right about incrementalism. I can point out, ironically, being someone from an oil and gas producing state, someone from a coal producing state, I would tell you that I think the single most significant climate legislation that was passed in the 6 years that I was there was the carbon capture stuff that we did. And so I can point to all of these things that prove that we can move our country forward incrementally and actually achieve results. Now, in climate, we're in a climate crisis. There's no doubt about it, and people want to deny it. But if we're going to solve it, it needs to be recognized more broadly than just a political issue. It needs to have the people like John McCain, who in the past were willing to step up and talk about climate. And so, and if you come at them so hard, and if you come at them with this gush of, the Green New Deal, they back up and say, I think we got a problem. North Dakota will tell you 65% of the people in my state believe climate's a problem. They may call it weather, but they believe climate's a problem, right? But when they get hit with the Green New Deal, they're like, I'm not for that. When they get hit with Medicare for all, when they know that they've got a healthcare problem, that's going to take away their private insurance, which, by the way, a lot of them like. I'm not for that. And so that then becomes kind of, you got to bring people along. And I think sometimes when you want people to take a giant leap, when things aren't yet at that stage like the Great Depression, where people are willing to take a giant leap, I think that you lose momentum for the cause.
So I'll say two things. Number one, I think all of us agree here that no matter who the nominee is, we are going to put up and do the work and make sure that Donald Trump is not president. That being said, right, I just think that right now we are in a moment where elite institutions in this country have had the privilege of not paying attention to the degree of urgency that exists for everyday folk. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I grew up in the era of Obama. I remember watching Barack Obama win his election fundamentally changed how I thought about myself. I could not have run for office had Barack Obama not ever run before me. I couldn't have seen that in myself. That being said, we did incrementalism for 8 years, right? And look where that got us. Look where that got us. We are in a position right now where we have to be thinking about a Donald Trump because that incrementalism has failed to pay attention for a bunch of people who are not well served in our system. And we know the urgency of a crisis. A crisis cannot be solved incrementally, right? If we have 12 years to act before this is irreparable, then at some point we have to ask ourselves, well, what are we doing? Are we waiting for everybody to come along, the John McCains of the world, to be like, yeah, maybe this is a problem? We don't have that kind of time. Inequality is accelerating. The level at which the very rich dominate, right? The systems in this country are just accelerating. And so unless we're willing to recognize that you need a systems level intervention, not just to try and dial it back a little bit, right? We are going to continue to make the same mistakes of the past 8 years under Barack Obama. We are not better. I'll just say this. We are not, as a country, better off 8 years after Obama was elected in 2008 than we were when he was elected. And I say this as somebody who loves him deeply.
I disagree.
I just don't believe. Look at where we are right now. Look at where we are right now. We are debating how we beat the most dangerous president in American history.
There was 10% unemployment when Donald Trump was elected, and people were wondering whether they were going to be thrown out on the streets. So the one thing that I would say, okay. So the one thing that I would say in this debate. Look at the great things that Obama did, the Affordable Care Act. Look at what he did with climate and the Paris, bringing people together. Look at the Iranian deal. All of those have been undone by Donald Trump because they were not bipartisan. And so when you do things unilaterally, you risk no progress when the political winds change. And I want certainty. I want stability in moving those issues forward.
I will just say, look, if they were as easily undone, like you said, structurally we have to ask ourselves. It's not just we assume that political leadership, right, solves all of these deep structural challenges in our society. And my point is that the systems that created a Donald Trump presidency were baked, right, before the Obama years, into the Obama years, and through the Obama years. Again, I deeply value Barack Obama, and I'm grateful for the things he did. However, in failing to actually solve the structural problems that we had, right, we were in a position where at some point we were talking about the icing on the cake rather than the cake itself. And what created a Donald Trump presidency is that we had failed to pay attention to that. And don't get me wrong, I appreciate the fact that racism played a huge role in it. I appreciate the fact that we don't give him credit for what he did for the economy in the short term. But the structure of the economy did not change under Barack Obama. The solutions to actually thinking about making sure that our healthcare system was equitable and sustainable, that did not change under Barack Obama. And unless we're willing to admit that, then we're at risk of going right back to the edge of the cliff we fell off in 2016.
Okay, so we are running out of time, so I'm going to take both of these questions at the same time. So if you want to say yours, and then you can say yours, and then try to keep your answers as brief as possible.
You poor thing.
I was going to open up with a bit of context. I was thinking about the supermajority from 2008 to 2010. I don't understand how we were able to lose sight of Medicare for all. And then I was thinking about it a bit. As soon as Obama was elected, he seemingly dismantled the volunteering apparatus that he'd built up as comparable as Bernie Sanders and simply told them to go. These were young people who were willing to stand by him and fight on behalf of him if he simply had a press conference and said, do a march on Washington, be able to primary someone like Joe Manchin from West Virginia. What do you two think about galvanizing young people like myself? I've talked to a number of people in my family. They don't care. But all of a sudden, Andrew Yang comes up, talks about $1,000. They might care again. What do you guys think about galvanizing people who've never been a part of the political process and actually weaponizing real fervor among young people? Because the time among boomers, I mean, that's kind of, well, I'm sorry, guys. It's, I mean,
he's not a boomer.
I honestly don't want to touch on ageism a bit, but politics is changing. How does the Democratic Party be able to galvanize in much the same way that the Republicans are able to galvanize so many factionalized groups? We're a mess, but how do we tap into young people?
Okay, so we have one question on young people, and yep, go ahead.
Hi. I was wondering that we're in a time of very high factionalism to the point where we have to have this whole debate, but we're also in a time where congressmen and women are so scared of being primaried that you have a lot of straight down party votes, and there's little actual, the parties are very united when they're actually voting. So I was wondering if either of you thought that this period of factionalism could actually be a moment of opportunity to start dissuading that fear of voting down against the party line.
You want to take the youth one, and I'll take
Yeah.
the one.
Look, no matter where I go, if I'm talking to young folk, there is an urgency about this moment right now that is clear. And that urgency is what will create change. We forget that in our political system, it's not just about who gets elected. It's about what we as a society do through our civil society, through our press, to move those who have elected power to do and to act. Like, we forget we have that power. One of the best things about 2008 is that Obama did build that coalition, and then, like you said, he sort of bundled it up and put it on the shelf. And so it didn't go into government with him. We have to govern from the streets, right? That's not to say that we don't pay attention to the laws and make sure that things are done through our system, but that is to say that the power of people to raise their voices, to demand the changes that they want to see, that's the essence of democracy. That's what creates the system. It's what sustains it. I think the best thing about the Trump years is that we saw that reignited, oftentimes in opposition to some crazy policies that Donald Trump tried to push forward. But we saw it reignited. My question is, where does it go from here? And my other point is this, is that like these movements that young people are building, be it the Sunrise Movement, be it the folks who are building behind Medicare for All, these folks are going to dictate what the future looks like. I'm just saying, right? I'm just saying, get out there, keep going, right? Talk to your friends, keep organizing, build the future you want to grow up in, build the future you want to raise your kids in, because it is your future.
You know, it's interesting because Bill Clinton and Donald Trump basically governed the same. Whenever things got too hot or they felt like they weren't making progress, what did they do? They went out on the hustings. They held rallies. Bill Clinton did the same thing. I mean, not without the crazy, but you know, he wasn't Donald Trump. I'm not saying that with the Trump rallies, but Clinton was always willing to take his case to the people, and that made him more powerful as a president. I think Barack Obama did not do enough of that, and he could have kept up that kind of coalition, that spirit, and be able to march into Washington with all of the support that he received when he was out there. I want to talk about, you know, a lot of, to your question about people being afraid of being primaried and everybody votes the party line, and I think the best thing that's come out of this polarization is movements in this country to try and have dialogue. There's a woman in Baltimore who has something she calls Thread. And you might think that Baltimore, you know, kind of, what do they have in common with urban-rural issues? Well, Baltimore is a very diverse community, and she basically started a nonprofit where she is integrating, because they're not integrated. We're not integrated. You know, liberals live here, and conservatives live there, and the Trump people live here, and the African Americans live here, and the Hispanic. So this myth that we're somehow integrated in this country is false. And there is so many now grassroots movements to integrate this country and broaden the dialogue. And I think that if there is one good thing that's come out of all of this, it's that people are taking charge to have a better sense of who we are as Americans. And one of the things that we've lost, if you said, what does it mean to be an American? If you had asked my 21-year-old person self, I would know. Now I think it's just because the changes are disruptive to kind of the traditional power struggle, or power structure. That all of the demographic changes have created an uneasiness among traditional power elites. They're going to have to figure out how we build a better country all working together and not working at odds. And some people would say the solution to that is term limits. I'm not a believer in term limits. They're called elections. But I think we have to have much more robust dialogue about policy and elections instead of personalities and he said, she said kind of stuff. And so, I mean, I think we're going to get there, but I think it's going to be driven by the people of this country being exhausted by being so mad and scared and divided.
Last comment. Yeah.
All right, so I really appreciate that point. I think that right now we can drive forward on whatever agenda we choose. The thing that I think I find most frustrating in this political moment is that sometimes we fail to empathize with folks and ask, what is the pain that drives the choices that you make? And I'm not saying, obviously, that does not necessarily apply to Donald Trump, but a large swath of our country voted for him. And I think it's really worth us asking why. How do these folks go off voting for a guy like him? And I think part of that, sure, part of that is racism. Trust me, I know, right? Part of that is a culture war. But part of that is also a frustration with this moment and a failure to be able to meet just very, very basic needs. My hope is as we wage our politics, that there is always a level of empathy that we bring to it to ask, why does this person in front of me do what they do? And how can I try and be just a little bit more human with them? I think that does suggest certain policy goals that we should have, but at the same time, it also should mean that we wage our politics with kindness. That means that we wage our politics with honesty and truth, And at the end of the day, that you can smile and look somebody in the face and say, you know what, we share this country and I'm grateful for that, even if we disagree on which direction needs to go. And I think as young people, as we do drive forward and take our democracy by the horns and take it in the direction that we think it needs to go, I hope that if we can infuse some of that, right, get away from some of the cancel culture on Twitter, get away from thinking that, you know, you're either with me or against me, but being able to say, like, who are you as a human, even if we're trying to do this hard work of building a country together and the times are hard right now.
Great, thank you to Abdul El Sayed and Senator Heitkamp, and thank you for coming.